We evolved with the sun. The question is, did we evolve to make the best of a bad situation, i.e. evolve to survive the sun, or to maximize a precious resource? And we did both. Jeff, we're back.
It is ironic that we're recording this particular episode on the summer solstice, the longest day of the year.
Also when the sun gets highest in the sky, which will be quite relevant to where we're going.
Indeed. We've talked about the human relationship with the sun in the past, more apropos to the effect of blue light on setting our circadian rhythm and the spewing forth of blue light at irregular times of day that can disrupt the hormonal balance between cortisol and melatonin, hence impeding proper sleep. But that's not what we're going to talk about today.
No. So that's a mismatch that affects circadian rhythm. Today we are going to talk about much more...
Yeah, it's more nuanced because in our prior discussion around the sun and blue light and circadian rhythm, the sun is really pretty much the good guy all the time. And in this
the more
particular...
you can follow and match the rhythms of the sun to the rhythms of your body, great. And also, same across all human beings.
True dat.
But now it gets more complicated.
Yeah, because in this episode, we are going to delve into the evolutionary mismatch of essentially how our culture, the way we live, hijacks and upends our biology. So we spend about 6% of our time outside now, so 94% of our hours, waking hours, in a car or inside. So removed from the sun's rays and particular bands of the electromagnetic wave spectrum, which we will touch on. And this divorce from the sun has numerous impacts on human physiology because we evolved in relation to the sun's rays. And over the course of history, there has been significant immigration and in some cases forced migration that have created certain mismatches with regard to pigment and sun exposure. So let's get into the sun and certain kinds of electromagnetic radiation that come to Earth so we can basically set some ground conditions for this discussion. Specifically, what we're really talking about in this particular episode is UVA and mostly UVB, ultraviolet B, electromagnetic radiation that comes from the sun and its impact on human physiology.
I mean, broad strokes, the sun emits radiation at a whole wide range of wavelengths, infrared, heat, good for avoiding the next ice age, generally good for the human body. That's the lowest energy radiation. Well, there's lower, but that we're going to talk about today. Then you get visible light, useful for seeing things, and medium, like a little bit higher energy, but not very much, not a big effect on human physiology. And then you have UVA, UVB, and then you have UVC and X-rays and gamma rays. And the good news is that the Earth's atmosphere blocks pretty much all the X-rays, gamma rays, and UVC, which are high energy radiation. We all know when you go to the doctors and they take a X-ray, they go hide behind a special wall because it's not good to get a lot of exposure to that high energy radiation. Right. So it's very clear, like infrared, visible light, low energy, no problem. X-rays, gamma rays, thankfully blocked by the atmosphere, problem. But then there's this little band in there that is kind of in the middle.
Yeah. And there's like 100 to 350 nanometers or somewhere in there. I don't know my bands the way I used to. But so these enter the Earth's atmosphere and they interact with our skin. Now, we all have different skin color across a spectrum, and this is in direct relation or a product of a certain kind of cell that we have in our body called melanocytes. And melanocytes produce a pigment known as melanin, which is the primary pigment in differentiating our skin color. Now, obviously, we've thrust all sorts of social and political constructs on top of this, which we can explore in a minute. But just pure biology, because nature doesn't really give a shit about politics. Nature and biology just function on their own. Like, what is the relationship between melanin in our skin and UVB and UVA rays?
Yeah, well, it exists for a reason, and there is a reason that darker skinned peoples evolved toward the equator, and as humans migrated away from the equator, they didn't need that adaptation, and they evolved lighter skin. So
yeah. In fact, it turns out, and we'll explore this, it was more adaptive to be lighter skinned at higher latitudes, and it was more adaptive to be darker skinned in and around the equator.
So I think we need to take a quick detour into how UVA and UVB, particularly UVB radiation, is affected by where on planet Earth you are, because that will help explain a little bit more of this. So the further north or south you are, the more toward the poles, the sun is coming through the atmosphere more obliquely, hitting more atmosphere, more scattering and absorption, particularly of UVB. The closer you are to the equator, the more directly UV radiation is coming in and hitting human skin that's in those locations.
Right. Shorter path, generally more consistent day length, less cloud cover often. Just you're more susceptible to a higher concentration of UVB rays if you're in and around the equator.
Yeah, and this is a little counterintuitive, because I was thinking, well, in the northern high north, high south latitudes at summer solstice today, you're getting tons of sunlight. And
right.
It's true, there's a lot of hours of sunlight, but the sun actually still stays relatively quite low in the horizon. Right. In fact, it stays lower in the horizon than it does, for example, at a city at the equator or near the equator at midwinter.
Yeah. And so over vast swaths of time, humans evolved in relation to their environment. So because there were a higher concentration of UVB rays around the equator, those people that lived around the equator had more melanocytes and more melanin, and that was protective and adaptive for a number of different reasons.
Well, yeah, so let's get into why it's adaptive, because UV radiation essentially messes with our biology and messes with all biology. But when UVB in particular hits your skin, it can directly damage DNA. It can directly damage cellular components. When UVA penetrates the skin, it goes a little deeper, a little bit longer wavelength, and it causes inflammation. It actually basically can strip electrons off of molecules inside your body, which good old reactive oxygen species.
Free radicals.
Good old free radicals. So basically the sun,
the
sun can directly cause damage, particularly UVB towards the surface of the skin, but even UVA penetrates and causes damage via reactive oxygen species, free radicals, and the inflammation and everything that goes along with that.
Right. So if you were evolving over generations around the equator and you were getting blitzed with a lot of UVB, over time you would essentially adaptively produce more melanocytes, which would produce more melanin, which essentially disperses UVB rays when it hits the skin.
Yeah, so melanocytes are the
cell type.
The cell type that produces melanin, and melanin, literally when a UV radiation hits melanin, it converts that higher energy radiation down into infrared, aka heat. So UVA, UVB hits melanin in the skin, converts it to heat, much less harmful for the body, not going to cause cellular damage, etc.
Right. And so this is why, and we're backing into this slowly, that exposure to UVB radiation is correlated with a number of skin cancers. Obviously, many people are familiar with melanoma, which comes from melanocytes, and basically all omas, tumors, are related to their cell type. So melanoma. For the very reasons that you outlined earlier, because essentially over time, an accumulation of DNA damage in the skin due to exposure of UVB will...
Not just UVB though, UVA
too. But just the headline more that people read is UVB will essentially create damaged DNA, which will then create essentially potentially cancer cells like basal carcinomas at the bottom of the epidermis.
Yeah, all skin types, every skin cell type can be cancerous, turn cancerous. Basal cells, squamous cells, melanocytes. There's lots of other ones that can also be cancerous. They're just more
basal cells tend not to metastasize. Basal cell carcinomas tend not to proliferate.
Those are the base layer of the skin. They're kind of like stem cells at the bottom layer of the skin, and they migrate.
The epidermis, And then, but melanomas obviously can be metastatic and can get into the lymph and spread, and they can be, fatal. And there's growing like efficacy and therapies for metastatic melanoma. In fact, we had Kevin Courtney on this show, who has essentially come into full remission from stage 4 metastatic melanoma. That being said, it is something that you should assiduously avoid. So,
But basal cell carcinoma, you're getting that a lot of times from UVA, is my understanding, because the UVA is penetrating to the basal layer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and while basal cell carcinomas generally aren't as pernicious,
still not good.
It's not good, and they require like excise, and you've probably seen people with like big divots, although they're getting better with those surgeries. But I think Skylar's had numerous basal cell carcinomas on her face and stuff like that.
And this actually can be problematic on the face in particular, where there's not a lot of room to excise them.
So this is the more pernicious side of UVB and UVA, and it's particularly pernicious in relation to people with paler skin, because they have, of course, less melanin, so they have less defense mechanism against this particular kind of radiation, which is why people with paler skin have traditionally been encouraged to wear sunscreen. We will talk about that not yet. But of course, this is why, while there still is skin cancers amongst dark-skinned people, it is much, much less prevalent.
Yeah, so I pulled some stats on this. So white skin subjects approximately 70 times more likely to develop skin cancer than subjects with black skin. The efficacy of melanin as a sunscreen, about 1.5 to 2 SPF, possibly as high as 4 SPF, implying that melanin absorbs 50% to 75% of UV radiation. Basically, an SPF of 2 means the doubling of protection against sunburn.
Right.
And so while black epidermis allows only 7.4% of UVB and 17.5% of UVA to penetrate, so not a lot, 7% UVB, 17% UVA, in white skin 24% UVB penetration and 55% UVA penetration. And then there's a whole bunch of other more complicated things that, to be honest, are a little bit beyond my biological pay grade, but essentially melanosomes in dark skin are better in a variety of ways that lead to less carcinogenesis from UVR. For example, dark skin produces more eumelanin, which is, again, effective in a variety of ways that were in the research papers I was reading that aren't worth trying to tease out here.
Yeah, and I think you pulled these stats. The places or the countries in the world with the highest prevalence or incidence of melanoma, number 1, Australia, number 2, New Zealand, number 3, Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, Switzerland, Germany, Slovenia, Finland. Generally, populations that are
White.
Yeah,
I mean, there is some interesting stuff in there that I don't fully understand, like why Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway. The Australia one is, I think,
more obvious
and dives right into the mismatch that we're talking about. Might as well just go there briefly, and we can circle back and recircle back. But Australia was colonized by Englishmen. Yeah. Sydney, Australia, approximately 34 degrees south latitude. London, 51 north, about a 17 degree difference. Doesn't sound like a huge amount, but UVB intensity generally increases about 6 to 10% for every degree of latitude closer to the equator. So the lower latitude, the UVB intensity increases 6 to 10%. UVA radiation, as you kind of have alluded to already, is more consistent across latitudes, but still varies with atmospheric conditions, aka clouds. So on a cloudy day, UVA radiation can be reduced by 30 to 90% compared to clear sky conditions, depending on cloud cover thickness and type. It's very variable depending on the type of clouds. But like London, 180 to 200 cloudy days, Sydney, 90 to 120. So you get quite a big difference in UVB radiation exposure for someone that was evolved to maybe be in the United Kingdom, all of a sudden living full-time via maybe forced migration in this case, actually, because it was a penal colony.
Yeah.
But whatever, migration for whatever reason from one
break
latitude.
the law and you get the sentence of melanoma.
Higher risk of melanoma.
There you go. Well, Sven certainly loses out here and across the Scandinavian countries, seemingly. And of course, there is another cultural dimension here, which is that, pale skin historically, if you go back a couple hundred years, was, the bomb, if you will. It was like, if you had
fat
pale
and
skin,
white. You wanted to be fat and really pale.
Because essentially that communicated the fact that you had a lot of leisure time and that you were not working outside in the fields.
And you had lots of food available.
Yes.
The plump white, nymphs of the Renaissance painting.
Right. How times have changed.
Well, interestingly, Industrial Revolution, everyone was working in the mines or inside factories. It was no longer possible to tell someone's class by how
the tint of their skin.
Yeah, by how tan they were. So actually, it does make me wonder, and we're going to touch on tanning beds and vacations in this as well.
Sure.
But I do wonder if Denmark, Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, really, really white, really pale people, ethnically, meeting a bunch of cultural factors, for example, wanting to be tan from a perception of beauty, vacationing to
southern Spain or wherever.
And one of the things, might as well just say it now, that I had in my list is that intermittent intense exposure to UVB is particularly bad for
that seems to be the highest risk determinant for the development of certain skin cancers. It's like this intense intermittent subjection and exposure to UVB. So it's like basically if you have very, very pale skin and you go to like Cancun and just bake out,
particularly burn, that's also
burn.
part of it.
Yeah.
If you burning is worse than not burning.
Right. Because what
seems
tanning
pretty obvious.
Actually,
It's pretty obvious you've damaged something.
Because what tanning actually is, aside from anything cultural, is a protective mechanism for the very reasons that we're describing. You get tan in order to disperse more UVB rays.
Yeah, I kind of, when I first dug into, I love researching for these podcasts, and occasionally they will change my mind about some things. And I had really been culturally steeped in this, the tan is healthy. Interesting when you go and dig into some of the history around it and in political, socioeconomic implications. But I was steeped in this, and I read something that essentially said a tan is a sign that you have received skin damage. And I was like, no.
Yeah.
But UVA, so first of all, UVA is what causes primarily tanning, which is why tanning beds are so bad, because they'll be like, we don't have UVB light in there. Of course, they don't want you to get sunburned in a tanning bed. What they want you to do is get tan. But it means they blast you with UVA.
Yeah, it's like Diet Coke. It's like, we don't have sugar in here, but
exactly
900 other things you can't pronounce.
Well, in this case, one thing, lots of UVA light, which still does cause DNA damage and can cause skin cancer, because it is the tan is you producing more melanin to protect yourself because you've received a lot of UVA exposure and damaged, have caused inflammation and damage in your skin.
While a couple hundred years ago it was a reflection of class and leisure time to be pale,
I guess I didn't finish that thought.
After the Industrial Revolution, that flip-flop, that it was an indication of class and leisure time and means to be tan, and that the fact that you might have the means to actually go on vacation or
the
be
winter
outside.
tan.
The winter tan
is the classic example of that, as a sign that you have the money and wealth and time to fly somewhere else, which is the epitome of an evolutionary mismatch. We not only are we talking about migration, where white people moving to latitudes that they did not evolve for, and we're going to talk about the reverse later, which is black and darker skinned people moving to higher latitudes,
by choice and not by choice, but yes,
both. But also just the inside of a year flying somewhere that your skin is not designed for.
Right. So the moral of the story: just live local, stay home, don't go anywhere.
Buy the farmer's market.
Another reason to be local. So
unless you've already been grossly mismatched via your chosen location.
That's true. Yeah. Well, and then this progressed all the way to, when I grew up, there was this image that was on every other billboard, seemingly, of the copper tone girl, and it was such an odd image to revisit, candidly, because the caption on that massive photograph was "Don't be a pale face," and it was a 5-year-old-ish girl, kind of outside, clearly on vacation. There's sort of a palm tree loitering in the background, and then a dog has approached this girl and bitten her like bikini bottoms and pulled them down, such that you can see this significant chiaroscuro kind of white butt set against this very, very tan body, which is like, the whole thing is so strange, because it's sort of like the sexualization of this girl, the "don't be a pale face." There's just so many weird components of it. But the main idea is like, go get tan. Even kids.
Well, and that brings me to 2 points that are in my notes here. One is that why I think skin cancer is so difficult for us to kind of internalize. It's one of these risks that is cumulative over time, and we as humans are pretty bad at assessing like long-term.
Hello, global warming. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Long-term cumulative risk. But essentially what's happening is that one DNA mutation in one cell is unlikely to cause cancer, but you accumulate these mutations over time, particularly, as you said, from UVB, because UVB will create what's called dimers, where certain base pairs will fuse together, and those will get passed to the next generation of that cell and continue on. And then if that happens again and again and again.
And she told two friends, and she told two friends, and she told, oh my God.
Well, no, it's just at multiple points in the DNA strand, and if you basically knock out enough of the checkpoints that are preventing cellular proliferation, you have cancer, because that cell will keep going beyond its checkpoints.
Yeah.
And so, sorry, I didn't finish. The other piece of that is, as a result, childhood intense sun exposure can be particularly bad. I think partly because of the nature of genetics in children, not entirely clear on that, but also just because you're starting the clock and the accumulation of these DNA issues earlier.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there was a big change of opinion around exposure to the sun at the beginning of the 20th century. Also, there was some discovery that UVB, I believe, addressed tuberculosis. And so there started to be these kind of sun therapy treatment centers, most famously in the Adirondacks, where you would sit out in the sun for most of the day. And that is the etiology of the Adirondack chair.
Oh, I always love a good scientific, word situation.
Sure.
Well, what it actually was is that they discovered that UV light killed TB, because UV light, to go back to where we started, UV light and biology don't really get along. UV light is generally not good for biology.
Unless it is stimulating the endogenous production of vitamin D. And this sort of takes us to the flip-flop of the mismatch, because what you see in a lot of darker skinned people that then move to higher latitudes is a massive deficiency in vitamin D for kind of the same
the same reason. Whole preventing UVB from penetrating the skin, remember that stat that I said earlier, is good for preventing damage to DNA and your skin, but then you are blocking the UVB that hits a cholesterol derivative in the skin cells and then creates pre-vitamin D, and then ultimately the liver and your body does a bunch of complicated chemistry, and you end up with citriol, which is vitamin D.
Yeah, and then vitamin D, if I remember correctly, sort of forages and harvests calcium and phosphorus, which are essential for bone health.
It does a lot of
and
things.
Other things.
Even like sperm motility. Learned that one doing research.
Yeah, doing what kind of research?
On the internet.
Okay, yeah, sure. That's the best kind for sperm motility. So obviously vitamin D essential for bone health, and like immune health. Like all these little adaptive immune cells generally have like vitamin D receptors on them that I believe enhance the capability or the efficiency of developing antibodies for
there's no question vitamin D really good in your body.
Very good thing. So if you have a deficiency of vitamin D, like a certain generation of Somali children, I should say, there was a significant, and this is sort of strange, but like there's a significant Somali migration to Minnesota. And this was a study that I believe Mary Pardee referenced
in her course.
But essentially what was happening was because for this very mismatched context, or in this mismatched context, essentially these Somali children were not producing any endogenous vitamin D because their skin was so dark and it's at a very high latitude, so you're not getting a lot of UVB. And they were, their vitamin D deficiencies were so low. They were like 2 or 3 when you should be, I think, like in 40 to 70.
Yeah, well, 30 is the cutoff. 30 nanograms per milliliter is the cutoff for deficiency, and the kind of functional medicine range is like 40 to 70. You want to be like 50. Yeah. You don't want to be hovering around that 30.
No, I think range. I was like 62.
Yeah, that's great.
It's good. I got other problems.
Yeah.
But not vitamin D.
Well,
but I got vitamin D.
But they had rickets.
They had rickets. And you're like, what the heck? Rickets? It's like scurvy or something. It's like no one gets rickets anymore.
You know who had rickets? Tiny Tim.
Tiny Tim.
Yeah, Tiny Tim. That's one of the things I learned also.
Yeah.
He's represented, the Tiny Tim representation.
Well,
because so many children in England during that time, partly because of the sky and partly because of the latitude.
Such a dreary place to live.
But also because of the pollution and because of children working in factories, lots of kids with rickets.
Yeah, and because they have so many good writers that everyone stays inside and just reads and drinks fucking Darjeeling. Anyways, which is great, but awful for vitamin D production. But so rickets, which sometimes shows up as like bow-leggedness, but obviously then can obviously brittle bones, not a good thing, but it can result in osteoporosis and all these other kinds of things. So basically if you have dark skin and you live in northern latitudes, you've got to supplement vitamin D
so rickets is an acute condition.
Yeah.
And some of the things I was reading is it's not as gone as you think it is. But just on a total population level, the data I have is, this is National Health and Nutrition Examination Surveys. Yeah. 42% of the population is deficient, period. So below that 30. But 69% of Hispanics, 82% of blacks.
Yeah. Well,
and so you talk about so the Somali thing is interesting, but
it's like the most extreme example.
It's the most extreme, but black migration, aka slave trade, moved people with very dark skin from equatorial areas
to higher latitudes.
And just to give a sense of higher latitudes, the 37th degree
parallel,
37th parallel, above that, during winter months, you are almost guaranteed to be vitamin D deficient. There's simply because, again, of the angle that the sun goes through the atmosphere above the 37th parallel, from fall to spring, you will be vitamin D deficient already. Like, you're going to really struggle already to make enough vitamin D. And that's like North Carolina, Greece, Turkey, northern part of Iraq. Like, it's not as far down as you might think, or as far up as you might think.
Yeah.
Like, Minnesota is way up. I think of Minnesota as quite far north, but not necessarily Carolina.
That's true. Yeah. Carolina was in the Confederacy after all. Minnesota was not around, I don't think, at that point, but
all still struggling with vitamin D.
Still
during the winter months.
Yeah, irrespective of what happened in the 1860s. So then those who have difficulty for the various reasons that we've discussed producing endogenous vitamin D do need to supplement. And that's good. The fact that we can supplement with vitamin D, it's very, very safe. The safety profile around vitamin D. I mean, it's very hard to OD on vitamin D.
Yeah,
I think
that's one of those myths.
Hypervitamin Dosis or something. It's just barely ever really exists.
Yeah, Dr. Mary covered this in her course, The Truth About Supplements, as well, that those cases are almost all from like infants being misdosed via vials where they thought it was 4,000 IU and they were giving 40,000 IU consistently. So when the recommendation that I've seen...
missed a decimal point.
What's You're on the droppers. Sometimes it's confusing. You're a little sleep deprived as a parent. Basically, to achieve blood levels of 40 to 70, most people need to consume about 1,000 to 4,000 or 5,000 IU a day.
Yeah.
But that is very dependent on how much sun exposure you have, particularly during the time of day that UVB is happening, so like 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. But this is just where it's in these stories. It's so nice to just be able to tell a nice, clear story that go out in the morning and get your morning light because it's going to reset your circadian rhythm. This is one of those where our body has evolved a tension between two things, and it's like, well, which one do I do?
Yeah,
and of course the answer is the middle path.
Yeah, you're on the teeter-totter. You're always seeking equilibrium or homeostasis between these two opposing forces. And so you have to supplement with vitamin D if you need it. But on the other hand, you have to protect your skin at times from UVB and UVA. And this is where, the sunscreen conversation comes into play, because kind of in natural health circles, which we both hang out, sunscreen is often pilloried as for its chemical content, etc. So we need to kind of unpack this a little bit. So we should talk about sunscreen.
Yeah, let's talk about sunscreen. I also just want to talk briefly about the concept of natural, because I think our community is like very much, if it's natural, it's good. And where I started to evolve my opinion here is like
poison oak is natural.
Poison oak is, ooh.
Yeah. I love a good natural poison oak.
So we say we evolved with the sun. The question is, did we evolve to make the best of a bad situation, i.e. evolve to survive the sun, or to maximize a precious resource? And we did both. Yeah. So sunscreen.
So sunscreen. So Coppertone was a sunscreen-ish, but it kind of evolved at this time where, people were also lathering on like baby oil and using like aluminum reflectors to kind of maximize tanning in UVB, etc.
Well, not UVB. The thing about a lot of the sunscreens is they would block some UVB, but they would let all the UVA in.
Yeah, I mean, not the oils. The oils would actually help absorb more ultraviolet radiation.
The Greeks would put olive oil on their skin,
and there was like an SPF of 8 or something.
Yeah, SPF of 8 and some sand on top. And that's SPF of sand. SPF of rock.
Yeah. There was something else going on there. I'm not putting no sand on myself.
Oil and
sand. Sure. Mud.
Greek.
Maybe mud.
No, well, the Egyptians used rice bran, jasmine, and lupin.
Okay.
Rice bran?
Rice bran?
Yeah.
Okay. What about raisin bran? That also works. This is like, I grew up in the 70s. It was like Coppertone, aluminum reflectors.
Well, and the idea was to get
Ovaltine and Raisin Bran and Tang.
Okay.
So yeah, the idea was like, let's get our tan on. But then, getting more into the serious realm, we started to develop sunscreens, and the first sunscreens, as you say, blocked only UVB and not UVA. So they used to basically be like, oh, look, we're protecting you, but not really in some cases. And they started using various different chemicals, benzenes and different forms of benzenes, avobenzene and some other benzenes that I will reference my notes on, that were potentially were chemicals that were absorbed into the skin, and that was the way they provided protection, candidly.
Well, they all provide protection exactly like melanin. That's what's really interesting, is that essentially sunscreen is artificial melanin, and what we should draw a distinction here is between chemical sunscreen and physical sunscreen.
Yeah,
So
mineral derived.
or mineral sunscreen.
Yeah.
So mineral sunscreen like zinc oxide and titanium dioxide essentially just reflect the UVA, UVB out.
And those usually show up like this, almost like covering yourself in toothpaste. I mean, this is what Skylar wears.
This is right in my family too.
Yeah.
This is the basically rice brand.
Modern day rice brand. Yeah. I mean, it works by a completely different mechanism than the chemical sunscreen. So it basically reflects, as you say.
Yeah, and the chemical sunscreen is absorbed, and when the UVA, UVB, if it's a broad spectrum, so that's the term that you should be looking for if you want a sunscreen that blocks both UVA and UVB, does exactly what melanin does. UV radiation hits it, converts it to infrared heat.
So Skylar like lathers zinc oxide on, and she looks like a total freak. And that's why I think generally people don't do it, because she has little vanity left, but like, she'll go out and play tennis, and she's very pale skinned, and so she lathers this stuff on, and she looks like a white ghost. And she doesn't wear makeup, and she doesn't do other things. So that's like one thing that chemical sunscreens allow you to do, is you can wear makeup and still look like what quote unquote normal, and so that's.
You could also wear really cool hats like I do.
Yeah.
Really cool UV shirts.
Yeah, you look like you're on safari all year.
Perpetual safari.
And so, these are the decisions that you have to make. So one is, between chemical and mineral derived sunscreens. And then there's obviously different levels of SPF.
But this is where sunscreens kind of ran afoul of our wellness community, because toxic load is a real thing, and it is one of those things that right now the recommendation from the CDC is wear sunscreen every single day, everyone except infants. And that level of like, I know a lot of people that bristle against that sort of blanket, but it's the sun, and you're recommending that we put chemicals on ourselves every single day.
Yeah. Like, okay, so here I have my notes now more ready. Chemicals in sunscreen that have raised health concerns. Oxybenzone, so absorbed through the skin and has been linked to hormonal disruption and allergic reactions. Also can harm marine ecosystems, particularly coral reefs. There are parabens. I've talked about parabens a lot on the show.
Fragrance. A lot of them have fragrance in it, which who knows what's in fragrance.
Yeah. That's why they have parabens in there, to maintain the fragrance. There's homosalate. This is used to help sunscreen penetrate the skin, but it can disrupt hormones and create toxic byproducts, etc. So,
but there is, this is a case where chemical is not the only option.
Right.
Vanity. It's chemical or vanity.
Yeah, as it so often comes down to, is like our culture has hijacked our biology, right? Always. So it's like we want to look good. We want to meet societal, cultural beauty standards. So we put these chemicals on us because they are the most convenient option, to...
Well, if you're worried about skin cancer, or, to be honest, and I would put myself in this camp quite recently, we just think that the sun is great.
Right.
And then you do some more research and realize that maybe you're... So again, to that natural thing, if this was actually a situation where we have evolved to make the best of a bad scenario, then technology is an aid. And technology, I include titanium, sunscreen and UV shirts. This is not just...
Yeah, you can also, if you care, look at the UV index that's on your phone. So if the UV index is like 0 to 3, it's relatively safe. You can actually even still get tan. But, anything over 8, which is high, and especially like 11 or 12, you're running the risk of severe burns, which is, what we talked about earlier, that could be the biggest determinant
Yeah, the most
And-
conservative voices would say, though, that even like the desire to be tan is representing
Yeah.
an increased skin cancer risk. I just want to say
Sure.
that. I think there is an article that just came out in the Atlantic June 2024 edition called Against Sunscreen Absolutism that has the rather suggestive subtitle of Moderate Sun Exposure Can Be Good for You. Why won't American experts acknowledge that? And that's the kind of, you know, the wellness community like cheers at that sort of thing. And you dig into the article and it is really interesting. But again, it's such a tension. It's like UVB decreases your immune response in your skin, which is bad because as UV light is causing damage, it also is reducing your inflammation response, your immune response. But that is good. It seems to be quite good for psoriasis, preventing psoriasis and autoimmune conditions. And so we're in this tug of war. We're in a dance.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I often go back to this question or this lens through which I try to make decisions about health in general, which is how did I evolve? And, you know, there are some general principles that apply to the species as a whole, and then there are some specific criteria that pertain to different people based around their specific set of genetics, which in this particular case has been determined, and in many cases is determined by the environment in which your ancestors evolved. And so obviously we're not living in a world, nor should we, nor do we want to, where all people with pale skin just like live in northern latitudes and stay there, and people with darker skin live at sort of equatorial latitudes and just stay there.
And don't go to a tanning booth.
Yeah, and that you know, ship, no pun intended, has sailed.
Yeah,
sorry.
yeah.
So, you know, because, you know, one of the kind of like fascinating things to think about in terms of evolution is that, you know, if like those Somali immigrants stayed in Minnesota for long enough, and this is just like
a total hypothetical,
ridiculous thing to consider,
yeah.
because there's obviously all sorts of like interracial reproduction and all these kinds of things. But essentially, if they were like stayed completely within their own community over time, thousands of years, they would essentially evolve to become lighter skinned. And the opposite is true as well, as if essentially Sven and his clan moved to equatorial Africa and didn't intermarry, etc., stayed there for long enough. Basically, like genetics and evolution would do its thing. You would have certain mutations, you know, as it pertained to melanocytes and the production of melanin. Those mutations would be more adaptive for survival over time, whether that was protecting from UVB rays for melanoma or producing more vitamin D, depending which group you're in. And over time, you would essentially become adapted to your environment, and you would take on those genetic characteristics. And so, yes, if you want to argue,
it would be very slow though, because
I mean, thousands and thousands of years.
even slower than, because if you think of the nature of what is the pressure is death from skin cancer, which by the way, they found in pre-Columbian mummies from about 2,400 years ago in Peru, diffuse melanotic metastases on their skeleton. So we know that skin cancer has been around, and in this case, you could probably say likely killed these people that lived in Peru. But so it would take a long time because the pressure wasn't necessarily very strong on it.
Yeah, I would say the Beverly Hills mummies also run a different risk. And this is the moral of the story, which is generally where we end up with a lot of these things, is that, you know, everyone needs to find that middle path, that balance, you know, between essentially protection from melanoma and, you know, vitamin D production. And this is the dance that we're doing. And, you know, you can get very, very easily tested for both things. You know, you go to a dermatologist and they can very easily test for different kinds of skin cancers. And, just in your regular blood panel biomarkers, you can get your vitamin D levels. And so this is, I think, where people can take, agency and to be knowledge is power, and, make appropriate decisions without being swayed by sort of the myths of, living a certain kind of way, whether that's the natural way or whether, that is the way as dictated by, our public health institutions.
Yeah, and I think the last point I'll make on this, which is similar to what you're making, is that I realized how like politics and history science can be. We like to think of it as outside of those kind of softer arts where we intuitively understand that the winner writes history and they're going to write it from a certain perspective. Or politics, you're going to take a certain issue and you're going to spin it and you're going to tell the story and bring out your points in debate that support that see through a certain lens. And the sun and how it interacts with our body, there's a lot, because we have so much interaction with the sun on an evolutionary basis, there's a lot of points you can pull from, and you could very easily tell the story that is like, the sun is so good for you, and that's true, and you can line up all this evidence, and then you can come and grab a bunch of evidence and tell a story that the sun we evolved to be, make the best of a really bad situation, and sun is harmful. And can you hold both of those stories in your head at the same time and be on the teeter-totter, walk the middle path, and find that balance in your life that is not one or the other? In some ways I agree, against sunscreen. In some ways I agree, against sun absolutism.
Yeah, totally. I mean, the fascinating thing about biology is to study biology is to study history. They're actually inextricably woven or interwoven versus, chemistry and physics that are essentially, there's, objective laws and truths to those. And obviously we're always evolving, though, the discovery of certain things within the world of physics and chemistry. But to study biology is to study history. And, I think that's what makes it, so fascinating to unpack. So this was fun. This good.
This was a lot of fun, Jeff. Thanks.
I'm going to go get out in the sun.
I'm going to go put on my UV shirt and hat.
Yeah, hot. Nice. Hey, thanks a lot for watching. If you enjoyed this video, then I think you'll love this one too.